It's Pride Month, and I, like all corporations, am ready to capitalize on this opportunity to milk money from the homosexuals. No, but really, the timing of this video is purely coincidental. I've been meaning to make a video on this topic and a few more like it for a while now, but I've not been able to take out the time that is required to do justice to such a complex subject. Well, I do have some free time now, and while I'm certain that I'll miss out on a lot of nuance, I hope to explore as much of this topic as I possibly can in a short video. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. Before we look into representation in games, we have to understand why representation is important to begin with. First off, a certain brand of people seem to think that LGBTQ plus people enjoy the same rights and privileges as cisgendered heterosexual people, but such a statement is ignorant beyond belief. Not only is this untrue in tons of developing nations around the world, it's false even in the context of developed countries where acceptance rates are on the rise. Heteronormativity is still very much a thing, and suicide rates among gender and sexual minorities are disturbingly high even in these regions. Next, we need to understand how representation can help us combat this. Here, we have to draw a distinction between good and bad representation. Oversimplifying this paradigm, good representation attempts to provide a holistic view of queer characters, while bad representation confines them to stereotypes. When you hear about representation reducing prejudice, it's good representation that's being referenced. Good representation in media, the kind of representation that most advocates strive for, generally involves multidimensional characters whose defining traits are independent of the stereotypes associated with the minority group they belong to. Well rounded LGBTQ characters in media serve to increase awareness and acceptance in the same way that contact with an actual queer person would, just in a more impersonal manner and on a wider scale. LGBTQ representation in gaming has a long spanning and extensive history, is what I'd like to say, but the truth is far from that. A lot of the early representation in gaming was hardly representation at all, at least not in the way that we perceive it now. Considering the general lack of awareness in the 1980s, I suppose it is to be expected that representation during that time period would steer firmly in the opposite direction from good representation. According to Wikipedia, I know using really reliable sources here, the first documented representation of a gay character in gaming goes back to 1985 when the character in question was, wait for it, a murderer and drug dealer. Everything we look for in a man, really. Now, I personally think that gay characters in video games go farther back than that. I mean, Pong is literally about two genderless entities slapping balls at each other. You'll be happy to know, though, that it wasn't just the gays who were being portrayed negatively in games at the time. No, transgender people received a similar treatment. Here's what Nintendo had to say about a pink dinosaur in their game about a plumber beating his brother up. Quote, he thinks he's a girl. He'd rather be called Bernetta. Real classy. We could sit here and talk ad nauseum about all the different ways in which LGBT stereotypes, instead of LGBT characters, were portrayed in early gaming. From flamboyant gay men to butch lesbian women, these representations have all the subtlety of a Reddit post starting with, I don't have a problem with homosexuals, but. Characters that are of particular interest, and more pressingly, concern, are gay characters who are portrayed as being rapists or pedophiles. What makes such characters even more disgusting is how they're often played for laughs. In the original Final Fantasy VII, for example, there's a section where Cloud has to cross dress. It is implied that he is groped by men in a bathhouse, and this whole segment is meant to be a gag, with the punchline essentially being, male essay is funny, huh? This section was amended in the remake, with Cloud instead getting a happy ending massage and an adorable makeover. So I suppose we can conclude that LGBTQ representation in gaming, as in media as a whole, is improving, right? What I think most would consider to be the turning point for representation in gaming came with the accidental inclusion of homosexual romance in The Sims. The original Sims game had provisions that prevented same sex relationships, but these failed due to a mix up during a live demo of the game. I think it's only fitting that the first act of semi decent representation came unintentionally, considering how one of the main characteristics of good representation is that it seems natural. Following this, a lot of games included what I'll call Schrodinger's homosexuals and bisexuals. Copyright trademark. Verity Richie has an excellent video on this topic, but I'll try to provide a bastardized summary. In a lot of games, RPGs in particular, there are characters whom you wouldn't know are bisexual or gay unless you pursued a romance with them. Of course, in the case of gay characters, you'd still get the prompt for romancing them. With bisexual characters, you wouldn't know unless you had separate playthroughs as both genders. I suppose we should be glad that these games allow people to romance NPCs regardless of the gender of the player character, but more often than not, there are only a few such Schrodinger's bias in these games, with the rest of the characters being either gay or straight. A study I found examined and quantified the different forms of queer representation in games. Although the relative proportion of the different identities represented were about what you would expect, a finding that I found to be really interesting was that RPGs contained more LGBTQ characters than any other game genre. This makes intuitive sense on a multitude of levels. Not only do RPGs generally contain more distinct NPCs than most other gaming genres, it only makes sense that LGBTQ individuals who might be struggling with identity confusion would turn to games that allowed them to shape their characters how they see fit. Turning our focus to other sexual minorities for a second, a similar but not exactly identical phenomena to the Schrodinger's LGBs is observed in the case of asexual characters. The difference here is that there's no way of telling if the character is asexual unless the game devs say so themselves. Aloy from the Horizon series, for example, is believed by many to be aroace. Unless she explicitly states that she experiences no attraction, or Gorilla themselves say that she identifies as such, most of us will probably assume that she's just as invested in the plot as we are to appreciate the finer things in life. Another trend that I want to touch on that's not exactly representation so much as it is inclusivity is how games present binary sex options in character creators these days. In the Demon Souls remake and Elden Ring, instead of male and female, these options are provided as body type A and B. Considering the history of demeaning portrayals of genderqueer characters and the vilification of transgender characters as they experience homicidal gender confusion in games, such subtle changes are appreciated, but I wish we got more trans characters in the main storylines of games, if only to see people lose it on Twitter and quote tweet Neil Druckmann like that'll do anything. After all this discussion, I suppose we can conclude that the gay agenda is being sufficiently promoted and the frogs will be extinct very soon, right? Well, while I don't disagree that representation has improved a lot over the past few years, there is still a lot left to be desired. Let's take Persona 5 as an example. There's a highly distasteful scene in the 2016 title that features a straight male character being harassed by drag queens, and this is, of course, played for laughs. I just don't understand the obsession with looking down upon men's SA experiences. This scene was altered in Persona 5 Royal, but the amended scene is hardly better. The drag queens still come across as really pushy, and they are still played for laughs. The irony is that the entire game is based on the idea of self acceptance and positive change, but it couldn't stop itself from taking jabs at gender non conforming people in the name of fan service. Also, consider that queer coding and queer baiting are much more common than queer representation. Queer coding is said to occur when characters are given traits that suggest they're queer without any explicit indication of them being queer. Queer coding is representation without representation. In current media, queer coding can become frustrating, and as a result, it's often conflated with queer baiting, or the use of poor queer representation or the suggestion of such representation to draw queer audiences in. Riverdale is the quintessential example of queer baiting. An early episode of the show features a kiss between Betty and Veronica when both characters are portrayed as being straight otherwise. Examples of queer coding can also be found in video games. In Persona 4, Kanji is a playable character who must overcome his demons by accepting his interest in quote unquote feminine activities. This character isn't portrayed as being gay or queer, but his story is one that resonates with queer audiences. I don't think that Kanji's inclusion is queer baiting though. No, that honor goes to Chloe, Rachel, and Max from the original LIS game. The queerness of these characters is implied but not realized in the game. It's only through the prequel that you get an idea of their relationships. The Life is Strange series has taken major strides towards improving representation of its queer characters, but I think it's an early example of a trend we'll see more often going forward as more developers attempt to cater to queer audiences without any actual intention of doing so in a meaningful way. Additionally, a lot of good representation comes from independent developers. Hades is known for its tasteful representation of queer characters, and no AAA game has come close to representation of this form. There need to be more queer narratives explored in games. While there is a rise in representation through secondary and tertiary characters, protagonists in major releases are seldom queer, with the exceptions being player self inserts in RPG games. But a lot of these games also feature character creators which allow you to create green amorphous blobs, so well. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll go read tweets about how inclusion of any minority character in a game makes the game political. Always remember, go woke, go broke. Bye.